By the way, I think this is the coolest name ever. I'm going to introduce you to Monzy Merza with Splunk. Monzy serves as the Director of Security Markets at Splunk Incorporated. He has over 15 years of tactical and cybersecurity research experience in government and commercial organizations. His experience has included vulnerability management, security product testing, penetration testing, adversary modeling, cyber tools and infrastructure development. He has also served as a content developer and instructor for cyber trainings and red blue team exercises. Monzy has been an invited speaker at government and open conferences. Monzy's current research is focused on integrated approaches to human-driven and automated responses in targeted cyber attacks. Let's give a round of applause for Monzy.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to share a little bit of story with you. This was right around 2000, and I got a phone call to join a team. And when we got to the meeting, I was met with some peers that I had worked with before, and the assignment was very simple at face value. The assignment was that we had a target, and we had to take something from that target. And that's it. No other information. As a red team that had capabilities from expert lockpickers to radio jammers, that was scary as hell for us. Now, I want you to think about why that might be. This is a red team that has never failed. But we were concerned because we didn't know anything about this target other than its name and what we were supposed to take from it. So we went back to the drawing board and thought to ourselves, we are really, really good. We have never failed. We are exceptional. We are world class. So we looked back at all of our previous adventures to try to sort out what is it that made us successful. And then we started to dig through that process. We came to a conclusion that it's not so important why we were successful. We came to a conclusion, what is it that made the defenders unsuccessful? So before I give you the punchline, I have a question for you. Imagine that you have two armies. One that's going to go and battle on the battlefield of another army. This army knows its terrain. It's been persistent in that environment. It understands the environment. It's been there before. It knows where the hills are, where the mountain is, where the river is. And this army has never been there before. Who do you think wins? It's the one that knows the terrain. We were afraid that we didn't know the terrain. But more afraid than failing, we were afraid that we didn't want to be discovered. Yes, we had a lot of exploits that other people didn't know about. But we don't want to go in an environment and expose our weaponry because we don't know what the environment looks like. We don't want to lose our weapons to the enemy. In this case, it's the defender. So what does the defender have that the attacker doesn't? I believe that the defender has an unfair advantage over the attacker, only if the defender chooses to utilize it. And most defenders don't utilize it. And that opportunity is the opportunity to control the terrain. Because it's the defender's terrain. The attacker must come to the defender. The defender deploys the environment. The defender knows where the keys are. The defender knows who the users are, or at least can know who the users are. The defender can know who the assets are and where they lie and what they're used for. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about how you, as the defender, can take control of your environment and how you, as the defender, can get an unfair advantage over your attackers. See, the problem is that most organizations, when they think about cyber defense, they put the defender in a box, just like that on the left-hand side of the screen, or right-hand side from your perspective. And we kind of have this strange notion that somehow you're sitting in a box and there's an attacker outside and is slinging arrows and things at you and you're under stress and nobody really knows what you're going on. You're scrambling and it's constant pressure on the defender. I want to help you change this mindset because unlike a physical world and in the cyber world, you can shift your boundaries, you can change, you can adapt, and you can force the adversary to show themselves or force the adversary to be stonewalled. This concept of terrain has lots and lots of different layers and lots of different aspects to it. When you look at the DoD definitions of cyber terrain, it concludes everything from geography, topography, to law and policy. And everything else in between that you and I know really, really well, like networks and operating systems and routers and applications and services. So how do we start to rationalize that? This is a new concept. There's a lot of things. And you as a defender, forward, also have to deal with a lot of complexity. This is a picture from telegeography that was built on a sponsored project from Amazon. You can actually download this picture. It's kind of a cool artifact that has a lot of information. They even have an interactive version. But the reason I bring this up is I'm going to talk about some things that are going to sound overly simplistic. But I show you this picture just to render to you that I understand that there is complexity. But I think there are simple ways of managing that complexity. Today, people get seen pictures like this one. Some person on a keyboard, really awesome, having a great day. There's all these things. They're going to move stuff around. It's going to be great. I was an analyst myself for many years. My life was more like this. It's not because I'm lazy. It's not because you're lazy. It's because you're exhausted. You don't know where to start. You know where to finish. You don't know what you're after. There's lots and lots of complications. Now, in contrast, here's another operator. You see the console for this operator? Yeah, it has gauges and dials and things that tell us what's going on. But this operator also has knobs and levers. This operator is equipped to make decisions based on what's in front of this operator. Those of you who are in the power industry are probably familiar with this console. This is a nuclear power plant console from the Daiichi plant in Fukushima. This operator can make decisions based on the information that he's receiving. So how do we go from being an observer to being a decision maker so that we can take control of our terrain and that we can manage our adversaries? I'm going to share with you a couple of examples on what to think about, and then we're going to go very concrete on how to action them. So this is the part where you start taking notes and stop paying attention to the little screen and look at the big screen. Principle number one, you can defend what you know. There's a lot of things to know, but this is not a taxonomy, but you can have a focus. You want to know your assets, you want to know your identities, and you want to know your business priorities. Everybody knows what assets are. That's like face value, but let's dive into it a little bit. Assets are not just endpoints or hosts or servers. Assets are all of those devices that you know of, your network devices, your switches, your routers, but they also include your applications, your services, your data warehouses, your relational data stores, applications that are running in the cloud that you use, applications on-prem. So when you start diving into assets, there's a whole world there that's beyond just endpoints. You want to understand where your assets are. Like a general on the battlefield needs to know how many soldiers and where they're located and how to communicate with them. You got to understand where your assets are. Identities, of course, everybody knows what identities are. They're related to accounts or users. But I want you to extend that definition. I want you to think about identities that are related to applications and services. Identities that are related to API keys and machine-to-machine interaction on how systems work together. And I want you to go and explore business processes and business priorities so that you can understand what keeps your business running, what helps you serve your mission the most. What is the most important thing in your environment that needs to stay up and running in order for you to be able to serve your mission? Is it a customer portal? Is it a power plant? Is it a distribution line? What is it for your organization that needs to keep the business running? So principle number one, defend what you know, and you can defend when you're able to understand your assets, identities, and your business mission priorities. Number two, measure, learn, and measure more. What does that mean? We talked about assets and identities and mission priorities. So you want to monitor your assets and your identities. Doesn't matter how you do it. Maybe you have a SIM, maybe you don't have a SIM, maybe you have some log aggregation system, maybe you have some sort of some management system of some kind, but you want to manage those assets and identities. Monitor those assets and identities. And then you want to apply analytics to them. You need a capability to apply analytics to what you're monitoring. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It could be something as simple as knowing how many, or knowing when, or knowing how. It can be simple math, simple aggregations. It could be very sophisticated, but it can also be very, very simple. So you want to apply some simple analytics on what's going on. And then you want to test those analytics. What does that mean? What that means is if there's a number on a dashboard and you can't identify for yourself why that number is there or what happens when that number changes, then that number should not be on the dashboard. There should be some other number on the dashboard. There should be some other analytic on the dashboard. So present to yourself that which is actionable so that you can interpret that and drive some change within your environment. So second principle, measure, learn, and measure more. Monitor, apply analytics, and then test those analytics and change them if they're not directly applicable to what it is that you're trying to accomplish and does not drive action. Third principle, build to adapt. I went to high school not too far from here, Laverne, California. Anybody live near Laverne? Oh, all right, woo. There's a few people. I went to Bonita High. If anybody's from Bonita High, that'd be double bonus for me today. You know, we used to have smog days sometimes. I played water polo, I played basketball. I actually got thrown out of the water polo team, so I can't really take full credit for that. But we would change. When the terrain changed, when the environment changed, there was a smog day, we would not have any sports. So if a real world environment can change, if real world human behavior can change given environmental impact, why do we believe that somehow our IT infrastructures have to be built in this static, rigid ways that they can't adapt in the face of an attacker, or they can't adapt when there is a need, there is a need to make changes to achieve better results? So number one, you want to have an environment, as people environment, to be open to change. And once you have that commitment, what you have to do is you have to prepare for that change so that when you deploy systems, you have to understand how these systems can be integrated and brought together such that a change can be enacted. You have to create little things, not monstrous automation across the environment, but little things where you say, under certain circumstances, I am going to take automated action, or I'm going to take accelerated action, which is human mediated. So if something takes me 25 minutes to do something, under certain circumstances, I'm okay to make that happen instantaneously. If something takes 3 days to change, under certain circumstances, I'm going to have a process that allows me to accelerate such that it can happen within a couple of hours. Create this mantra of changing under changing conditions. Change the environment under changing conditions. And once you have that concept that, yes, under certain guidelines, we are going to make changes faster, enable the people who are going to make the change to be confident that they're empowered to make the change. How many people have been at a talk, just like this one, where I can stand up to you and say, I really want you guys to ask me questions? And in reality, how many times does that happen? It's not because you don't have the permission. It's because you don't have the confidence, or you don't have a pathway. You don't know how to get to that point. So even though you may have something, you don't know how to execute on that. It's a very simple example, but it's the same thing within your environment where your manager comes and says, well, you are empowered to do this. But managers, you have to exercise that empowerment so your analysts and your team members know that they can actually make a change. And when they make a mistake, they know that it's going to be okay because it's not them that's being criticized, it's the process that's being criticized. That's how you create an environment for change. I see some of you nodding your heads. A couple people be like literally like pointing at me right now. Like, yeah, that. So build to adapt. So let's review the 3 things. You can defend what you know. Number 2, measure, learn, measure more. Number 3, build to adapt. Now, I'm an experimentalist. Theory is really awesome. I got into this industry because we can actually do things and we can make change. And I've already given you an example of changing the terrain while I've been standing up here. I've modified my own terrain up here. I moved these chairs back. They were in my way. It's okay. Now I can move very easily. Right? This is simple. So now let's take those 3 principles and put them into practice. There's lots of different ways and lots of different styles in which you can manage this, but after having the privilege of literally spending time with thousands and thousands of maybe not thousands and thousands, maybe closer to 1,000 organizations around the world. Small organizations that have maybe 30, 40 people in the IT department, to globally distributed conglomerates that have literally tens of thousands of people under employment just for IT services. I've learned 2 major styles that seem to work with high degree of return for organizations for security. There's lots of styles. This is not all the answers. These are the ones that in my mind seem to work the best for many people. There's others that work best for people as well. But even outside of the style, the first principle is anchor. That you want to pick something that you're going to build your entire security operation around. And you're going to go deep in whatever that principle is. You're not going to pick and choose. Things work in certain places because there is a guided principle of driving things deeper. 2 things that I've seen work really, really well. The first one is an anchoring and identity management. Christopher mentioned this in his conversation. I think Jacob mentioned this as well in his opening remarks. Identity management. What does that mean? Does that mean if you focus on identity management, you don't do incident response? No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is if you anchor in identity management, your incident response process flows around managing identities. And we're going to talk a little bit detail on how that works. The second one is vulnerability management. This one's near and dear to my heart. I spent 15 years of my life establishing a vulnerability management program at a very large government organization, and it was awesome, with an F in the front of it. And it works when we have world-class reverse engineers, but everything was anchored in vulnerability management. So let's talk about what that means. Remember our 3 principles. What were they? Knowing, measuring, adapting. So what do we do for identity management for knowing? The first thing you want to know, there's a lot of things you can know about identity management, but let's focus on things that are tractable and that you can actually action when you get back to work on Monday or Tuesday or whenever it is that you go back to work. Number 1, you want to know how identities and credentials are issued. How are they created? Does it happen when a new person starts a job and a new person is hired? Does it happen when somebody gets promoted? Does it happen when a new system is introduced into the environment? Somebody bought a new software package. I think Christopher mentioned if somebody bought an ERP system in your environment. Does that create new identities? What are the credential types that are used within your environments? Do you only have like one Uber system administrator category, or you have lots of different categories of power users or system users or application users that have varying degrees of authorities within and various degrees of privileges within a system? And do you have the knowledge on how identities or credentials or access is revoked or reduced? Does it happen when somebody gets fired? Does it happen when somebody changes roles or organizational units? Does it happen when somebody gets promoted or demoted? Does it happen when a visitor shows up at your front desk? How do their identities expire? So know the process on how identities are issued or created. What are the different credential types? And how are they revoked or reduced within your environment? If all three are like super crazy to handle because you come from some very insane organization and you think it's too high of a hill to climb, it's okay. Pick one. Just one. I want you to make a commitment to yourself now that when you get back to work, you're going to look into one of these and learn more about that. You with me? Now let's talk about measuring identities. Lots of things you can measure. You can use lots of different fancy tools and technologies. But the bottom line is this. Most important thing you want to measure is time and frequency. What does that mean? How many of you in this room have people in your organization that only work during regular business hours? Let me see a show of hands. You should all have people in your environment that work during regular business hours. Or at least I think you should. But you know who some of these people are. But you also have people who oftentimes work outside of quote-unquote regular business hours. You may have people maintaining power lines. You may have people responding to an emergency situation because they're in the fire department. Or you have people who work over the weekends because you don't have the luxury because you're in the you're at the LADWP where it's a 24/7 by 365 operation, by 366 by some measures. So you want to measure the time and frequency of how those identities and credentials are being used. You also want to measure who. This just happened yesterday. I was at a very large financial services organization meeting with one of their risk officers. And he literally had he had cards on a dashboard for each individual within the organization. He could tell what each one of those persons had done or was doing or what services they were accessing. Not because he's trying to spy on people, but because there's compliance requirements to ensure that the right people are accessing the right services. So that's the who. Who is using the identity? Who is using the credential? And then lastly, against what assets? Recall our definition for assets. It's not just an endpoint, it's applications, it's services, it's routers, it's badge swipes. So the time and frequency of who is accessing what, how often, and during what time window. And if you want to expand that into where and why, you can do all those things. But I'm a simple person. I like simple things. I want you to pick one out of these three that you're going to go back to your work and you're going to explore deeper on how to do that. We had three things, right? Knowing, measuring, and adapting. How do you adapt identity management? The first thing is you got to review your processes. Once you know the processes on how identities are issued or revoked or managed, you can then go take a look at this process and say, does this actually make sense to me given my threat model? If you have one. Or does it actually make sense to me because I have a dashboard that has a number on it? And how do I utilize that? And then once you understand that process, I want you to look for opportunities to accelerate or automate that process. Believe me, you can do that. There's a lot of things that you might do that you might look at it and go, but every time this happens, we do this. And if that's the case, maybe there's an opportunity for automation. Or every time this happens, I talk to 3 people, they all rubber stamp it, and then I go and execute my process. Maybe you can go talk to those 3 people and say, hey man, or girlfriend, help me just like cut the red tape here because I think we can help each other a little bit better. And then once you've made that decision that you're going to accelerate or you are going to automate, please communicate with everybody that that's what you're doing so that everybody's on board, so that those people become your champions, so that they can appreciate the value of what you're trying to bring to them. Remember, one of the biggest principles of knowing is knowing mission and business priorities. When you cast the changes that you're making in the context of business and mission priorities, people will come along. Because I know that everybody in this room wakes up in the morning wanting to do the right thing for their organization. And even when we get in arguments, at the end of the day, that's still what we want. When people argue vigorously, it's because they're passionate, they care, they're concerned, and they worry. That's why they don't just want to make certain change happen, which is why when you go and have a conversation about change with business and mission priorities as your focal point, people will come along. So now I have some completely different distraction for you for a moment. It's a public service announcement. If you're not using two-factor authentication, please, 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 I implore you to seriously consider two-factor or multi-factor authentication for your organization. I've talked to people of the Department of Energy that manage nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons too, actually. And they use multi-factor authentication in lots of different spaces. I've talked to some of the largest financial services organizations in the world. They have complex environments. Believe me, they have multiple policies and compliance regulations across the world. They have found ways to use multi-factor authentication where applicable. So please, 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 if you're not using multi-factor authentication, use it. Here's why. By using multi-factor authentication, you remove an entire attack vector for your adversaries. Christopher mentioned this, Jacob mentioned this earlier this morning. And I think George mentioned this as well. Just about every single attack uses credentials. And if that credential is reusable, once somebody has it, it's game over. It is the simplest and most active thing that you can do. Maybe it's not so simple, but it's the most active thing that you can do to modify your terrain and take away the power from the adversary. Imagine like giving somebody the keys to your car and they can't drive it. It's like, here, you can have this. I don't care. You can have my phone. You can have it. It's like, it's no good to you. Imagine having that kind of power. Multi-factor authentication gives you that. All right, back to the regularly scheduled program. We're talking about observers, going from observer to becoming a decision maker, and we're talking about you empowering yourself in order to do that. We talked about identity management as the key anchor. Second anchor, vulnerability management. We had three principles: knowing, measuring, and adapting. Thank you, somebody's awesome. It's working. What do you want to know? When you talk about vulnerability management, you want to know ownership. You want to know the name of the person who owns or is responsible for an asset. I want an individual's name. I don't want an organizational unit. You don't want the name of 3 managers up. You want the name of the person that you can literally pick up the phone and say, hey man, you got some stuff happening here, do something now. You want that person's name. You want to understand, you want to know the configuration of the system. And we're talking about configuration, and it includes all the things that you naturally think about. Operating systems, version numbers, patch status, what apps or services are running. But I also want you to include dependencies in the configuration. How many people think about their DNS server as part of their deployment that is absolutely essential to a running service? Some of you do. Some of you may not have had the opportunity to think about it just yet up until now. It's okay. Now you have. And I want you to think about the criticality of that particular system. Because think about it. We talked about 3 things, right? Assets, identities, and business and mission priority. The criticality is directly related to the business and mission priority. If you're running encrypted services within your environment and you have a time server, it's pretty damn critical. But it gets taken for granted. You don't have to do all 3. When you go back to work, how many are you going to focus on? Just 1. Thank you. Well, you guys are doing great. All right. Measuring. Configuration checks. You want to understand what your configuration checks are. You want to make sure that your environment is capable of, that you're capable of knowing how the configuration of these systems changes. The biggest thing here is newness. And it means exactly what it sounds like. I got it. Newness means that you make an assumption. And that assumption is that when you deploy a system for the first time, we can generally assume that it's not compromised. I know, there's exceptions, there's all kinds of attacks, and I've lived in that world, and it's exciting, and we can talk about edge cases. But generally speaking, it's safe to accept that when you deploy a new system, that system is not compromised. So what I want you to do is when you monitor systems, monitor for changes. Now, changes can happen for good reason, but if someone's communicating the configuration with you and that configuration is changing, there's probably something suspicious going on in that system. So keep track of the changes. Last one, adapting. The biggest thing that you need to do to set yourself up for adaptation is you want to integrate the tools. You want to make sure that whatever is critical of one of those three things that you've picked during the course of the conversation, that those things can actually be automatically integrated. There's no reason why you should be copying, pasting Excel sheets from one place to another to take some action. So you want to adapt and integrate your tools together. And you want to look at your policy and ensure that your policy allows you to adapt and integrate, and eventually to automate. You don't have to automate everything, but you can automate some specific things. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm over time, not according to my clock. I got 29 minutes and 53 seconds. But you can say this is all really nice stuff, Monzy, because you can just stand up here, come to a keynote, put on a badge that says speaker, and everything's awesome. But how do you know this can work? I'll give you the art of adaptability. Are you ready for this? Here's the art of adaptability. Number one, when you're looking for automation and adaptation, the first thing that you want to have within your system is auditability. So that anytime an action is taken, you can go back. Remember knowing exactly who the person was? That you know who it is that made that action and under what process that they took that action. That's auditability. Number two, reversibility. Just like that undo button on your word processor or the back button on your browser, if you take an automated action, make sure that that automated action has a counter-automated action that can be reversed. People get real comfortable when they know, hey, I can undo this thing like that. They're like, oh, okay, maybe we'll try it out. And you're sure, right? You can undo this. Reversibility. Last one, transparency. The logic for automation and adaptation has to be absolutely transparent to a person who knows nothing about the technology underpinnings. I'll give you a specific example. If Monzy goes to a website that is known to be bad, we are going to first patch his system forcefully and then let him go to the internet. People can disagree with your activity and your rationale, but they can at least see that there is a rationale. And you can argue over that, and you can make a good decision. That is the art of adaptability. So now let's put it all together. I appreciate your patience with me running late. It's your terrain. You control it. The adversary has to come to you. They have to follow your rules, they have to follow your models, they have to follow your pathways. You control each one of those aspects. You have an unfair advantage against your adversary because you can make changes without telling them. The attacker does not want to be discovered, so you have an advantage. And now, you have a number of things of which you're going to do how many? One, when you get back to work, so that you can use your actions to manage your attackers. Thank you very much.